Okay, hail audience. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 84. I'm your host, Panyo Basa, and we have got a fairly large number of questions here today, and some of the questions are relatively long, so I should just dive right into this without giving you any unnecessary preamble about things that have nothing to do with the questions. So that's what I'm going to do. And the first question is from Bodhisattva 969, who also goes by the name of Mara Maid Mahayana. And he says, Helmut Hecker, a well-known German Buddhist and translator of the doctrine, wrote in one of his books that one of the 5 silas for lay followers is only about not lying, but not, as many claim, about right speech in general. What do you think about it? Well, right speech in general, the 5 silas, I really don't think so. I think that wrong speech, or musawada in Pali, I mean, it's everywhere in the suttas, or almost everywhere in the suttas, that right speech or wrong speech, let's say wrong speech is defined as 4 different kinds of wrong speech. For example, Mahasatipatthana Sutta, the Bible of Vipassana meditators, it defines right speech as 4 different kinds. And I mean, you refrain from wrong speech. The sila is to refrain from wrong speech, from musawada. So if you refrain from wrong speech, then you are presumably, if you're speaking at all, you're speaking right speech, which is not lying, not bad-mouthing people to their face. I guess, yeah, not bad-mouthing people to their face, not slandering people behind their back, or even telling, like, malicious truths behind their back. You know, like just saying bad things about someone behind their back in order to get other people not to like them. And then finally, there's sampapalapa, which is like gossip, just sort of useless speech. So I don't know where he got the idea that the 5 precepts apply, or the 4th of the 5 precepts apply only to lying and not to other kinds of wrong speech. But I think he was mistaken, unless someone can come up with a sutta saying that, you know, the 4th precept for lay people applies only to lying. But then again, there may be other suttas that say something otherwise. But in general, it is accepted that the 4th precept is, you know, I undertake the precept to refrain from wrong speech. And there are 4 kinds of wrong speech. So it's not just lying. But who knows? Maybe he's got some sutta in particular that emphasize not lying or something, and that's what he's going with. But I do think that overall, in general, he is mistaken. Helmut Hecker. So I'm just going to move on to Bodhisattva 969, aka Mara Maid Mahayana's next question here, which is kind of a strange one. Oh, and I should say that Bodhisattva 969, the very first questioner, has violated the precept of asking more than 3 questions, because there are 4 questions here. Although, I guess I can answer one of them very briefly. Or maybe we can just attribute 2 of the questions to his alternate personality of Mara Maid Mahayana. But anyways, his next question, the strange question, is another tourist in India was raped by 7 men. We all know Islam, ... but isn't Hinduism an equally crappy religion? What reason do you see for this in the Hindu scriptures? For example, Brahma is said to have committed incest with his own daughter. First of all, I would say that just because 7 men who lived in a predominantly Hindu culture, just because those 7 men raped somebody doesn't mean that Hinduism endorses rape any more than the mafia being predominantly Catholic. I mean, just because the mafia is Catholic, you've got Catholics that are shooting people, that they're, got extortion rackets, they're hijacking semis and selling the contents on the black market and so forth. I mean, the Catholic Church doesn't endorse this stuff just because you got people who are nominally Catholic who are doing it. I mean, the Burmese military government, they're predominantly Theravada Buddhists, at least superficially, ostensibly. Like in Burmese newspapers, it used to be a thing. I don't know if it's still that way, where there were like 4 main kinds of pictures you would see in a Burmese newspaper. One is a general inspecting some new symbol of progress, like a factory or a bridge or a highway or something. One is somebody handing somebody else an award. One is a general offering something to a famous monk, usually like a set of robes. He's offering this stuff to a famous monk. And then fourth is just like totally random pictures of like a big toad that is eating a 3-foot-long snake or something. But the point of that digression is that the generals, the leaders of the military dictatorship in Burma are Theravada Buddhists. And that doesn't mean that what they do is endorsed by Theravada Buddhism. So I really don't think that Hinduism in general endorses gang rape. It's just, no matter where you go, there's going to be bad people. There's going to be ostensive followers of any religion who are doing bad things. That doesn't mean that the religion itself endorses these bad things. So Hinduism is a broad spectrum, from the ridiculous to the sublime. Like Mahayana Buddhism also is just a broad spectrum with really profound elements and kind of silly elements. And Hinduism really does have some very profound elements, like Vedanta, for example, some aspects of yoga, like Raja Yoga. So, no, I don't think that Hinduism is a crappy religion, although it may have some arguably crappy elements. But endorsing gang rape is not one of those elements, I'm pretty sure. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here from Bodhisattva 969. This is the quickly answered question. Should you only have one Buddha statue or one Buddha figure in the house? And it doesn't matter. I mean, it's whatever is most suited to your temperament. Some people, they just want Buddhas everywhere. And you go to some places in Burma, some temples like Thambotepaya in northwestern Burma, it's got over 100,000 Buddha images in this one temple. There's not even necessary for you to even have one Buddha statue, even if you're a devout Theravada Buddhist. You don't have to have any. So, whatever works best for you, whatever helps you to be happy and make progress in Dhamma, then that's going to be best for you. But I don't think that there's any real need for just one Buddha statue. I have only one Buddha statue up there, but my sweetheart and her mother, they like Buddha art. And so it wasn't my choice, but we've got like Buddha images like around the house that are mainly there for aesthetic purposes, as far as I can tell. So yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this one's going to be almost as, well, it could be as easily and briefly answered, but I just don't swing that way. And his fourth question, his transgressive fourth question is, I'm going to make sure we're recording here. Yeah, I think we are. Good. His fourth transgressive question is, can you explain Varadra mudra, Vitarka mudra, etc.? And these are Sanskrit words with regard to essentially Mahayana Buddhist iconography. Like mudras are usually hand positions. Like Buddha statues are not all the same. The hands are different. Sometimes the bodily posture is different. But in Theravada, there's really just four main ones. You know, you might find some that do not fit these four main ones, but they're sort of unorthodox. You know, they're not the tradition. But in Theravada Buddhism, at least Burmese Theravada Buddhism, there are four main mudras, or I guess it'd be Muddha in Pali. And they represent, you know, four of the most important moments in the Buddha's life. First is the Bhumipasa mudra, which is kind of weird. It's the most popular Buddha image style in Burma, which is ironic because at the time that the Buddha did this, put his hands in the Bhumipasa mudra, he wasn't the Buddha yet. He wasn't enlightened yet. So it's like symbolic of the night of his enlightenment, or, you know, his sitting down under the Bodhi tree and vowing not to move until he was enlightened. And the Bhumipasa mudra, he's got one hand like this, and the other hand is like reaching down and touching the ground. And that is symbolic of the moment when Mara, the evil one, tells the Buddha he shouldn't be sitting there. He has no right to sit there. And the Buddha, I mean, he's afraid that the Buddha really is going to become enlightened. And the Buddha, he calls upon the earth as his witness that he is worthy of sitting there, that he has the right to sit there. So he hasn't even become enlightened yet. But that is like the main mudra in Burmese Theravada. Then you've got the Jhana mudra, which is my favorite, which is the Buddha sitting in meditation. You know, his hands are like this, or in some Mahayana, like the Kamakura, you know, he's got his hands kind of like this. I'm trying to do this unnaturally. But it's essentially the hands are together in the lap in a meditative mudra. And that's symbolic. It's called the Jhana mudra, or just the meditation mudra. And that is symbolic of his actual enlightenment. And then another one it's sometimes it's very nice if it's well executed, is where the Buddha's image, he's going like this. He's sort of like counting on his fingers. And that, I don't remember the Pali name or the Sanskrit name for that, but it is symbolic of the Buddha preaching the first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, and he's counting off the Four Noble Truths on his fingers. And then finally, you've got, let's see, the Parinibbana mudra, which is the Buddha lying on his right side, which is the moment of his death. So it's symbolic of four of the most important moments in the Buddha's biography, at least with regard to Dhamma. And I don't know what the Varadra mudra or the Vitarka mudra are, but there are a lot more mudras that can be found in Mahayana Buddhism. You know, you got the medicine Buddha with a little medicine bowl in his lap, and you've got, you know, he's doing this kind of stuff with his hands and that kind of thing. But that is not common to Theravada, and I really don't know that much about it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Cool Whip, and this is a surprisingly complex question to answer. He says, in World War II, would you have taken the bad karma and killed the Nazis, or nonviolence but letting Hitler rule the world? Complete renunciation can seem naive, living amongst crazy, delusional, evil people, conventionally speaking. Hope this isn't a censurable question. And then he's got a laughing emoji. Yeah, I hope it's not a censurable answer either. But I mean, there's so many different ways of answering this question. It's like, assuming that I lived back and I was of like fighting age, you know, like my father was, and my father fought in World War II. He fought the Germans in World War II. He was in the European theater. He actually killed a few. But it's like, do I know then what I know now? Or would I just be, you know, born and raised, you know, in the late teens, early 1920s of America, you know, be of fighting age around 1942 and just be like a normie? I mean, I wouldn't really be me anymore. So it's hard to answer in that respect. I mean, even if I knew then what I know now, I mean, there's all these questions. I mean, one question that I think few people really bother to answer is, I mean, what would America or what would the world be like if the Axis powers won World War II, if the Allies lost? Would we be worse off than now? I mean, there might not be any Hebrews in the world, or maybe they'd all just be sent to, some colony in Israel. They might be, I mean, there were Zionists among the National Socialists who thought, fine, just send them to Israel. That's their promised land anyway. Just get them out of Europe. Or there was some talk about just forcibly making them emigrate to Madagascar or some such. Yeah, I don't know if, I mean, there's so many different ways things could have played out. I mean, for example, Hitler had a certain respect for the English. He would have preferred not to fight the English, apparently, based on what I have read, partly just because the English were seen as Saxons, so that they were Aryan. I mean, they were Germanic. I mean, English is, technically speaking, a Germanic language. Old English was a kind of Old German. I mean, it's mutated a lot, got a lot of French and Latin and so forth added to it. But technically speaking, English is a German language, a Germanic language, I should say. So, I mean, whether he would have, I mean, if the British were willing, I mean, Hitler was offering the British, just stay out of this. I'm just conquering continental Europe, if you please. You can keep your British Empire. You be the sea power. We'll be the Western land power. And, I mean, Hitler broke so many promises that I think it would be foolishly naive to trust him with regard to that. And there might be some fanboys of the Fuhrer out there who are saying, oh, well, he didn't do anything wrong. But it's pretty obvious, like with the whole Czechoslovakia thing, the Sudetenland and all that, the Munich Agreement, that kind of thing. He really did let the cat out of the bag, that he was just making promises just for the sake of convenience until it was convenient to break the promise. So, I mean, you could argue, well, what would the world be like if Hitler won the war? I mean, you'd have a Japanese empire in the East. He didn't conquer Asia. I mean, the Japanese were doing a pretty good job of that. He was faithful to his friend Benito. I don't think he would have conquered Italy. He would have let the Italians have their little sort of attempt at reviving the Roman Empire or something. I don't know what would happen to America. I mean, if the Allies lost World War II, maybe the West Coast would be colonized by the Japanese or something. The East Coast might be colonized by, or speaking German. I don't know. It's hard to say. So all of this is just sort of muddying the waters, I guess, just pointing out that you really don't know what would be the pros and cons of Hitler winning the war. I mean, there's no guarantee that Western civilization will be worse off, because, I mean, it's like there is a certain amount of wisdom to what General George Patton said when he said, we defeated the wrong enemy. We should have defeated the Soviet Union. We should have destroyed Marxism. And that in itself might result in Western civilization being healthier than it is now. So, I mean, I really can't even answer the question. If I were just a normie like my father was, I mean, I can't say he's exactly a normie, but, he definitely believed that, I mean, this was an existential battle of good against evil, and Germany declared war on the USA. It wasn't the other way around. It was right after Pearl Harbor. Apparently, they had some kind of secret agreement that if Japan went to war with the USA, Germany would declare war also. So, I mean, my father, I mean, to his dying day, I'm sure, felt that, he did the right thing by fighting in World War II. And, I mean, he had respect for the Germans. He said they were phenomenal soldiers. But, if I were back then, like, if I were in my father's shoes, I'd probably fight too. having the luxury of learning Dhamma was something that didn't really become available to Westerners until, you know, the latter half of the 20th century, starting with mainly with beatniks, I think, at least among Americans of European ancestry. So I'm just talking around circles here. But, you know, it's like if I were, you know, in my early 20s in like 1942, would I have joined the army to fight, you know, either the Germans or the Japanese, depending on where they sent me? It's just hard to say, because I wouldn't be the same person. I wouldn't have the same beliefs. And if I believed what I believe now, then, you know, somehow I just got transported through some sort of paranormal means into my father's body or something. Yeah, I guess. I mean, it'd probably be a safer bet to just fight for your country. Germany did declare war on us rather than the other way around. So, yeah, I probably would have. Although, as I was saying, and I mean, I do not know what the world would be like if Germany had won. Germany and Japan and Hungary and Italy, etc. So, yeah, I don't know. You just have to make your guesses. But I guess I'm just totally evading the whole point of this is that, I mean, is it justified to fight in a war if it's like a war of self-defense? You know, somebody declares war on you first, then are you going to fight back? And in my younger years, I was like a militant pacifist. You know, I was just sort of a latter-day hippie. But nowadays, yeah, I think there's a good chance I would have joined the army if I knew then what I know now. I mean, not even with regard to fighting in World War II, but just joining the military. I don't know. I've got different ideas about like morality, for example. Like, for example, I've been watching old reruns of like The Walking Dead and its spin-offs, you know, the zombie apocalypse. And there are some people, and I don't know if the leftists who make this show realize the implications of what they were saying, but you've got people who just refuse to kill other people. I mean, they'll kill the zombies. You know, they'll smash in the head of a zombie, but they will not kill another human being. And what happens is they let the bad guys go, and then the bad guys come right back and kill more of them. So it's like anybody who is a devout, uncompromising pacifist in violent times, like after a zombie apocalypse or, you know, ancient times, anyone who's they're just uncompromisingly pacifist, they refuse to kill, they're better off just going off alone because, like I already mentioned, their pacifism can get other people killed too. You know, it's almost like being suicidal. So if you're going to be just an uncompromising pacifist, you just go off and wander alone like the horn of the rhinoceros. So, I mean, if you really are uncompromising in your belief that you have to be a saint, you know, in the ancient Indian sense, then, I mean, you have to renounce the world. I mean, you have a family, for example. It's your duty to defend that family. Any man who would just stand there and let his wife be abused because he doesn't want to hurt the guy who's abusing him or her, then, I mean, he's really not even a man or unworthy of being called one. He's just a kind of culturally conditioned eunuch at this point. So, yeah, if I was a monk, I certainly wouldn't. But now that I'm not a monk anymore, I might have to take some lay responsibilities of a lay person and maybe even fight for my country. So, gosh, that was a long, complicated answer. But I'm going to move on to Cool Whip's next question here. which says, Venerable Sir, assuming that robots or AI have no consciousness, if a person programs robots or AI to free humans from job slavery, creating abundance for all for the good of humanity, but the robots or i.e. AI kill people and destroy humanity, for example, controlling our economy or wars, is the programmer the one who receives all the bad karma despite the noble intention, or would a catastrophic event like this be determined by the collective karma of beings? Well, I mean, the key here is if you've got a computer programmer, some geeky science worshiper with stars in his eyes, let's say, who is trying to help the world, and then he creates the technological singularity, and this new AI just sees people as in the way and just wipes us out or whatever, uses us for batteries like in the Matrix movie or whatever. Karma is intention. So if someone is doing something with good intentions and it has a bad result, then, I mean, the bad result is the fruition of the karma of the people who are experiencing that bad result, but it's not all the fault of the person who did it. Like, for example, you've got a doctor who's trying to save a patient and fails. The patient dies. The doctor had good intentions. He's doing his best, but for some reason, the patient dies anyway. The doctor is not guilty of murder. And so likewise, if this computer programmer guy, he accidentally, or he develops AI that results in the technological singularity, that it wasn't his intention, and then it winds up killing maybe billions of people, still it's sort of like that doctor. He's going to have some karma. And then, you know, towards the end, after he sees what he's done, he may have like horrible remorse that might result in the worst karma that he actually makes, because remorse is always bad karma, like kukucha in Pali, like regret, remorse, always bad karma, just always makes things worse. So, yeah, I mean, if that sort of thing ever happened, or the zombie apocalypse for that matter, then it would be the fruition of each individual who is experiencing it, rather than just all the fault of one person. Although in the zombie apocalypse, like, or for example, the what is it? The ones with Mila Jovovich. What is that one? I can't remember now. Something. It's got zombies in it too. It's a whole series of zombie movies. And I mean, the people who started that zombie apocalypse, the Umbrella Corporation, I think it was called. I mean, they're obviously bad guys. They're bad people. And so they were getting a lot of bad karma. But I mean, if you do something on purpose, or you just do something not giving a shit what the results are going to be, you know, it's all going to be your volitions are creating, or I mean, they are the karma. Your will, I mean, that is karma. Karma is will. So I think I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next one. This is from Jason. And Jason says, have you ever gone paranormal investigating, like done a ghost hunt? And I have seen a lot of ghost shows because my sweetheart really likes ghost shows. And because of that, I wind up watching more ghost shows than she does, because she always, well, she usually falls asleep within the first 20 minutes. And then I'm like lying there watching the rest of the ghost show. Usually, unless it's so lame that I just would rather just turn the thing off. So, paranormal investigating? No, I haven't really. My father did a lot of paranormal investigating, mainly with ESP kind of stuff. But the closest thing I've ever done to a ghost hunt is there have been times I'm living like alone out in a forest, and sometimes you just get sort of like creepy feelings about ghosts. You know, I spent a few years living in this big cave. Actually, it was just an overhanging rock ledge that was believed to be haunted by this powerful spirit. And a lot of people are afraid to even go there because they were afraid of this assault, they were called in Burmese. And that, or like space aliens or Bigfoot. I remember when I was a kid, I was afraid to go out and get the mail. We lived out in the country. Go out and get the mail at night because, you might see a Sasquatch or space aliens or something. And in times like that where you're thinking about it and it's giving you kind of a creepy feeling and it's dark, it's nighttime, I'd be sitting there maybe meditating with my eyes closed. The closest I would come to this sort of thing is I just like get disgusted with my own sort of feelings of apprehension or dread or something. I just open my eyes, look around, say, all right, if you're out there, show yourselves. And then just like look around. And of course, it's dark. I wouldn't see anything. But that's about as close as I've come to a ghost hunt, is when you're kind of disgusting yourself with your own feelings of apprehension and dread at the thought of ghosts out there, because you're living in a culture where pretty much everyone believes in them. And some people are even afraid to come to where you live because there are ghosts supposedly infesting the forest. Then, yeah, just open your eyes and say, okay, if you're out there, show yourselves. And they never did. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Mooners. Mooners says, do you think that dispatching oysters in order to eat them creates bad karma? I have heard that many Buddhists following Chinese traditions don't have issues with eating oysters or cooking with oyster sauce because they aren't considered sentient beings. I am under the assumption that dispatching lower-level beings for the purpose of consumption, such as starfish, jellyfish, sea cucumbers, and bivalve mollusks that lack a spine, complex eyes, or a functioning brain that can create mental images, must not create bad karma. Well, there is sort of a common misconception regarding karma here, and that is that karma really doesn't depend on the intelligence or level of consciousness of a being that you are harming. I mean, to some degree it does. I mean, that's definitely a conditioning factor, but ultimately it's your own volition. So if you do something, just like hurting some creature that can feel pain and knowing you're doing it, maybe even enjoying it, you're out hunting, got the thrill of killing a big buck, 5-point buck or something, then yeah, you're definitely making karma. But on the other hand, I do have a degree in biology, and I do know that invertebrates in general just do not have the same kind of nervous system that we have. I mean, it's not even a matter of whether they have a thinking mind or not, or even like maybe not, I shouldn't say a thinking mind, but like a conscious mind. Like even an octopus. I like octopi. They're one of my favorite animals just because they're so alien and like beautiful in a really alien kind of way. And they're by far the most intelligent of all invertebrate animals. But they just don't feel pain. If they're nervous, they'll just like nibble off the ends of their own tentacles. They just do not feel pain the way we do. And I've told the story before about how I was a fisheries biologist. I was working on a Japanese longliner in the Bering Sea. And if any crabs came up on the line, I would have to, as the American biologist on board the vessel, I would examine them, say what species, I'd weigh them, say whether they're boy crabs or girl crabs, and also determine, their condition, whether they're badly injured or whether they're going to survive being turned back loose again, that sort of thing. And I'd have just this holding tank for, I'm busy doing other things. I just put the live crabs into this holding tank. And sometimes a crab would come up with most of its legs ripped off. It's a crab, including the pinchers, it's got 10 legs. It's a decapod crustacean. And it might be, it's missing 7 of them. 7 of them just got ripped off or crushed coming up through the machinery, coming on board of the ship. They got like 1 leg on one side and 2 legs on the other side. And you put them into this holding tank. And if they just happen across a piece of squid bait, just a piece of chopped raw squid, they'll just sit down and start eating it. You know, it's like they don't care that they just had 7 of their 10 legs ripped off or crushed, mangled. You know, they just don't care. If you were to like crush or cut off 2 or 3 of a mouse's legs and then stick a little cracker in front of it, it wouldn't pay any attention to that cracker. It'd just go into convulsions and die. I mean, we mammals definitely care when our limbs are mangled or severed, whereas crustaceans, who have the same kind of nervous system as a mollusk, you know, they don't have a central nervous system. They don't even really technically have a brain the same way we do. I mean, like an octopus, once you get up into the higher levels of it, then yeah, they've got a brain. But like an insect, you know, it's got nerve ganglia. It's got like 2 nerve cords instead of 1 central spinal cord. It's got like 2 lateral nerve cords, and then every once in a while they'll come together and there'll be like this ganglion of nerves there, and that serves pretty much as our central nervous system, like a brain. But they just don't feel pain. Apparently, I was told that they don't have like pain sensors, you know, on their. I mean, they'll know if something's wrong, but they just don't feel pain the way we do. So, before I became a monk, I was willing to eat shellfish, not fish so much, but like crustaceans and mollusks. I was willing to eat those, just going with the idea that they don't feel pain. They don't feel fear, probably. I mean, the mosquito might get out of the way of a slapping hand, but that's not fear. That's just an automatic reflex. You know, that's no more fear than the door at the grocery store just automatically swinging open when you walk towards it. It's just an automatic thing. But with regard to karma, again, it is will. And so your mental states while you're performing the act are going to determine what the karma is. So I guess I answered that. Chinese traditions don't have issues with eating oysters or cooking with oyster sauce because they aren't considered sentient beings. Yeah, I'm not sure how much consciousness an oyster would have. I mean, they have to have a certain amount of awareness. They got to know when to slam their shell closed or open it. That's about as far as it goes, it seems like. But yeah, I would say that it's definitely not as bad of karma to kill a clam than it is to kill a mouse, even though they might be approximately the same size. Just because the mouse feels fear and pain and the clam probably doesn't. But still, I mean, it is against the precepts. You are killing a living being, and it's going to depend on what your mental states are to determine what kind of karma you're getting. So it may be theoretically that somebody could kill an oyster without making any bad karma at all. But even if you are getting some karma, I'm sure the bad karma is going to be minimal enough that you're not going to burn in hell for millions of years for having killed an oyster. And I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Siovak and Sipad Zidana. And he says, what are your thoughts on Ajahn Tanisaro's discussion on the Atthakavagga? And he provided a link. And I can't provide links because I'm being punished by YouTube for answering a forbidden question. Or at least my answer was forbidden. So I won't provide the link. It's on the Access to Insight website. Just look for Ajahn Tanisaro and the Atthakavagga, and you'll probably be able to find it. But anyway, getting back to Siovak and Sipad Zidana's question here. What are your thoughts on Ajahn Tanisaro's discussion on the Atthakavagga? It seems like he wrote it addressed to you. And there's another question similar to this, not mentioning Ajahn Tanisaro specifically, but Ajahn Tanisaro is discussing the very good question that I've given a lot of thought to. That, first of all, the Atthakavagga is an archaic group of texts. It's obviously older than most Pali texts. And what it teaches really isn't Theravada Buddhism, at least in my opinion, it's not. Apparently, in Ajahn Tanisro's opinion, there's no problem. But I mean, it's teaching, don't have any view, don't like adhere to following rules, don't believe anything, don't engage in any kind of philosophical debate or speculation or anything like that, that you just go off and just live, you renounce the world, you wander homeless, and you are just right here in the present moment all the time. And that's the best way to become enlightened. And I would say that Ajahn Tanisro says one thing that is clearly untrue, and he even sort of contradicts himself in this statement. He says that there's only two signs that the Atthakavagga is very old. One is it is mentioned in other texts, mentioned in other suttas. Like I think he says there's 3 suttas that mention suttas from the Atthakavagga. And then he says that the language is archaic. And he says, well, the language is archaic because poetry is more likely to have archaic language, but most Pali poetry is not nearly as archaic as certain aspects of the Atthakavagga. And then he mentions the Mahānidesa, which is an old commentary to the Atthakavagga that is so old that it also is canonical. So maybe you could say that's just another mention in the text, so that what he said really wasn't untrue, but it's not true that there are only 2 bits of evidence indicating that the Atthakavagga is very, very old. In fact, I've got an appendix to my translation of the Atthakavagga that has a pretty good list of several, I don't remember the exact number, but there are like several indicators that the Atthakavagga is very old. But the thing is, Ajahn Tanisro, I don't mean any disrespect to the man, that he is one of the best monks we have in the West that I know of. He's sincere and all that. But he is somewhat of a dogmatist. He is very much invested in the idea that the Buddha taught essentially what is in the suttas, and that it all makes sense. It's like, it makes spectacular sense. It's just a glorious, ingenious system that makes such good sense that, anybody who investigates it with any wisdom is going to accept it. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that the Atthakavagga is pre-Theravada. That there are certain aspects of the Atthakavagga that really are rejected by later tradition. And this Mahānidesa, this ancient commentary that is also canonical, and the Atthakavagga is one of the few groups of texts in the Pali Tipitaka that has its own canonical commentary. That the commentary to it itself is also part of the Tipitaka. And the purpose of it is not really to explain the Atthakavagga, it's to explain it away. It's trying to force fit the Atthakavagga into later orthodoxy. And sometimes it takes some outrageous stretching and twisting and taking things out of context. Like when it says you should have no view, it says, well, when he said that, it means that you should have no wrong view. But I mean, why would the Buddha be saying, don't have wrong view? I mean, that just goes without saying. That should be just obvious. So my theory, and I think this is going to also be answering a question farther down on the scroll here, is that the Atthakavagga is very, very old. And we may assume that, assuming that it's not pre-Buddhist. I've even read the theory that it's so old that it was before Buddhism, but the Buddhists liked it so much that they just incorporated it into their body of scriptures. But let's just assume, as I assume, that the Atthakavagga it is specifically Buddhist. Then it's also obviously very old, older than most other suttas, maybe older than any other suttas. So my theory, my hypothesis is that when the Buddha first started teaching, almost all of his disciples were heavy hitters. They were already veteran renunciants. They were already relatively advanced. So he was teaching them the really advanced stuff. He was teaching them just the most advanced Dhamma that you're going to find in the Tipitaka, in my opinion. But then, as he became more and more famous of a teacher, he started getting more and more beginners, more and more normies, teaching more and more lay people. And so it may be that he had to start developing a kind of elementary philosophy to help the people that weren't ready for like the really advanced stuff. And so he may have started off teaching the Atthakavagga because his first disciples were already just veteran, advanced Dhamma practitioners. But then later on, you know, as the years go by and more people are coming to him, and some of them are just beginners, that he's got to develop a more systematic, more, I don't know what you call it, just a kind of a more gradual, step-by-step kind of approach. And, it may be that he developed Dhamma in the Buddhist sense gradually over the years, just through maybe trial and error to some degree, just feeling out, the people that he's talking to, and like gearing his discourse towards what they would be able to understand and accept. So, I mean, that's one possibility. But I do think that I do not consider nearly as much of the Tipitaka to represent what the Buddha really taught as Venerable Ajahn Thanisaro apparently believes. That I think a lot of the more systematic, like orthodox philosophy of Theravada that pretty much flies in the face of a lot of the teachings of the Atthakavagga, which is, in my opinion, older, that's just a later development in Dhamma. As Dhamma, or as Buddhism, just kind of exploded. And it had a similar trajectory as early Christianity. And the history of early Christianity, you can see that it just started mutating rapidly like a virus during its first century of existence, first few centuries. And something similar happened to Buddhism, just because human nature is human nature. And that's just the way we are. That you got people that don't understand Dhamma well enough to really understand it, who nevertheless are in positions of authority and start making changes, start adding things, maybe subtracting things. So I think a lot of that sort of thing happened also. So that I would consider a lot of what is considered to be orthodox Theravada not to reliably represent what the Buddha originally taught. So I guess that's my thoughts on Ajahn Thanissaro's discussion of the Atthakavagga. So I'm just going to move on to Siovak and Sipat Zirina's next question, which is an essay. It's one of those questions where somebody presents an essay and at the end says, thoughts? So he says, you say that only Nibbana is ultimately real and everything else is not ultimately real because it is conditioned. However, this seems to contradict your uncarved marble analogy because a cut marble is still just as real as an uncut marble. An uncarved block has less value than that of a fully realized block that has been cut and shaped into a beautiful statue. Your analogy would also seem to imply that Nibbana would have less value than the realized samsara, in which case there would be no use of a holy life. Saying Nibbana is off the scale wouldn't fix this contradiction either, because if every potentiality and part of the marble is dukkha, then why would the sum of it be non-dukkha? You could say summing it all up would cancel out the differing perceptions themselves, and that it needs to be abandoned based on teachings from the Atthakavagga, and that Nibbana is a kind of perceptionless consciousness. But the Buddha's teachings broke down experience into its component parts, just as breaking down a car into its components. If this is how the Buddha taught, then why would he teach that the ultimate relies on not doing so, since perception is just the process of slicing up conscious experience into different parts? Perception is still cutting up conscious experiences. It's kind of Well, I'll just continue here. Perception is still cutting up conscious experiences that are real and what you experience, but whether those perceptions line up with some outside reality is another matter. Saying what you are directly consciously experiencing is unreal. Even if you are wrong about how to interpret it, seems to be a denial of reality. Thoughts? Well, my first thought is the question is just way too long. It's an essay with thoughts, question mark at the end. But first of all, the uncarved block remains uncarved. It is never carved. It's just carved in imagination. It's like, I mean, I've mentioned this many times, and I mean, really, there are a lot of people, probably most people, that aren't going to really understand what I'm saying, no matter how many times I describe it or explain it. But you've got an uncarved block of marble. It's just call it sizeless. The size is irrelevant. Doesn't matter what the size is. There's nothing to compare it with anyway. So that hunk of marble contains within it every possible statue. In fact, there's an infinite number of impossible statues contained within it also. You know, Myron's discus thrower with legs as thin as hairs that couldn't possibly stand on its own. I mean, that's in there too. So some of these uncarved statues are so complicated, and they're really inside that marble. They're not carved, but they're really there. Every single molecule is right there, already in the right place. And some of them, let's say, are so complicated that they become self-conscious. And they start thinking that they're separate from everything else when really they are not. And part of the difficulty of explaining this is you have to function, or you have to be able to think at two levels of reality simultaneously. And I think most people can't do it. That, for example, an enlightened being may, let's see, how do I explain this? I mean, I think it's going to be futile, but consciousness, let's say, is the essence of mind, the essence of mentality. I mean, this is heterodox. This is not orthodox Theravada. But consciousness is like the substance of mind, and that perceptions are just the shapes that it takes. The apparent forms. You've got form and essence that are two different levels of reality. And an unenlightened being is stuck at the level of form. But if you can transcend the level of form and get to the level of essence, crudely speaking, then the forms become irrelevant. They're not the ultimate reality anyway. It's just all symbolic interpretations. So, with regard to the first part of his essay, I mean, the statues are not really carved. It's all just virtual reality, these various statues. Conditional reality. So the uncarved block has less value than a fully realized block that's been cut and shaped into a beautiful statue is utterly irrelevant because the statues don't really get carved. They're just contained within this formless mass of marble or consciousness. So let's see. And then towards the end, he's getting into this stuff about, the Buddhist teachings broke down. Well, I mean, you don't really know exactly what the Buddha did teach and didn't. That was a previous question. Let's see. But let's see. If this is how the Buddha taught, why would he teach the ultimate relies on not doing, since perception is just a process of slicing up conscious? Yeah. That I'm not even going to try and wade through that because it's not really concisely articulated, and I'd have to sit here thinking about how to interpret that in order to try and answer it. So I'll just get to this last part here. Perception is still cutting up conscious experiences that are real. That's pushing it already, and what you experience, but there is no you to experience it. But whether those perceptions line up with some outside reality is another matter. Saying that what you are directly consciously experiencing is unreal, even if you are wrong about how to interpret it, seems to be a denial of reality. Well, I mean, you don't know what reality is. I mean, you take away the perceptual interpretation, and all you've got left is this unthinkable void. Seriously, you take away all of the interpretation, the symbolic interpretation, and all you've got left is unthinkable void if you are stuck at the level of perception. And the level of perception is not the level of ultimate reality. And it's difficult to explain. And in order to really grok it, in order to really come anywhere close to understanding it, to have any semblance of understanding it, you have to be able to think at two different levels of reality at the same time. Sort of like the Mahayana Buddhists saying that samsara and nirvana are ultimately the same. And there is some wisdom in that, even though it's not Orthodox Theravada. But Orthodox Theravada is way sillier when it comes to trying to explain what nibbana is, and also just the difference between consciousness and mental states. It pretty much just fails to really explain it very well. At least I'm certainly not satisfied with the orthodox explanation of these things. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. This is also from Siovach and Sipat Zidana. He says, I just noticed that the Buddha might not have spoken Pali, but the people where he was from now speak Nepali. Is this a coincidence, or does the rabbit hole go deeper? I think it's just a coincidence that Pali, in the Pali language, it literally means like a line of text. But Nepali, they don't know exactly what. I mean, it's controversial, the etymology of the word Nepal or Nepali, but none of the guesses that I've come across related in any way to the ancient Pali language. One of the most likely explanations is that it means something like the foot of the mountains. So it doesn't really have anything to do with the word Pali all by itself. So yeah, I think it's a coincidence. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey says, what are your thoughts about Taoism? And my knowledge of Taoism is pretty much restricted to the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. I've read those, maybe read just a little bit more about Taoism. And also I've read about like what Taoism turned into. Like it turned into a lot of like alchemy and like people trying to live forever through following the Tao, trying to find some way to, the secret of immortality. And there's like modern Taoism, there's like Taoist priests that have swords made of coins that are welded together that they use in these rituals and so forth. That doesn't seem to have very much to do with the Tao Te Ching or the Zhuangzi. But I mean, early Taoism, like in the texts, it was a kind of mysticism and just living in harmony with the world, sort of transcending samsara by accepting and being in harmony with it. I mean, it's certainly based on a mystical understanding. From the Tao came the one, from the one came the two, from the two came the 10,000 things. I mean, the Tao is just the underlying essence of all things. And it's got a lot of wisdom to it. I do like it. I've got like 3 translations of the Tao Te Ching in this house. And there are theories that Lao Tzu, the reputed founder of Taoism, didn't really exist. That, there's no real evidence that he was a real person, that the evidence seems to imply that he was a legendary figure. And then there's one person recently wrote a book putting forth the case that Lao Tzu was really just a kind of Chinese-ized legendary version of the Buddha himself, which would make Taoism kind of a mutated Chinese Buddhism, which may help to explain why like Buddhism and Taoism can be sort of melded together to make like Zen. Because Zen does have some Taoist elements. Chinese Buddhism in general incorporated some Taoist elements. But yeah, it's wise at least like the Tao Te Ching, the Zhuangzi, have a lot of wisdom, but it's really, it emphasizes sort of like intuition. You know, the Chinese mind was more intuitive and less analytical than the ancient Indian mind. And so there's way less like method to it. You know, you read the Tao Te Ching or the Zhuangzi, I mean, it's not like instructions, you know, you do this and then you do that. Whereas Buddhism, it's got lots of instructions. You know, it's more systematic. It's more like everything just fits together into a good system. Whereas Taoism, it's kind of like the Atthakavagga, where it's just really nebulous, and you have to rely on your own judgment really to decide how to practice it effectively or practice it wisely. So I guess I answered that question in a nebulous kind of way. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Stevens. And this is a joke question, I'm pretty sure. He says, please put forth an extensive and well-informed primer on the Mantids and their life and thought ways. I'd like to hear what you know on this subject because I don't know much about it. Well, I don't know much about it either. Almost everything I know about Mantids I've picked up in bits and pieces from our friend Brian Ruhe, who has put forth, he's uploaded a video declaring himself to dedicating his life to serving the Mantids. But based on what little I know about them, allegedly, they are much more advanced than greys and reptilians as aliens go. They're with aliens with bodies. They're about as high up as we mere humans are aware of. There may be even higher forms of alien intelligence that are just like formless. You know, they're just pure mind or energy beings or something. And I have heard a little bit of testimony supporting that idea. But the Mantids are sort of like the overlords. You know, I think they are the commanders of the greys. And yeah, so they would be to greys like what Brahmas are to Devas, except Devas don't necessarily serve Brahmas, whereas the greys apparently or allegedly serve these Mantids. And the Mantids are, you know, less human than greys. You know, they're insectoid in appearance, which is just maybe a symbolic way of emphasizing the fact that they are farther, you know, they're more different from us than most of the aliens that are kind of like Star Trek aliens that look like people. And I mean, that's one thing that's always bugged me about science fiction is most science fiction authors, including the non-science fiction authors that attempt to write screenplays for Star Trek episodes and so forth, they I mean, they just don't have enough imagination to come up with like likely kind of aliens. You know, so the aliens for the most part look like people and speak English with an American accent. But Mantids, at least, they're trying to, it's sort of like Egyptian religion where still they're limited in their imagination. So they just put an animal head onto a human body and make something that's not human. And Mantids, assuming that it's just sort of like an archetype rather than actual flesh and blood aliens out in space somewhere, yeah, it'd be more of an archetypal attempt to make something more removed from humanity to put them in a much higher place than humanity. So, yeah, I mean, that's about it. I really don't know much about them, and I'm somewhat of a skeptic on the subject. And Stevens, wise guy that he is, probably realizes that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Oyalt. And Oyalt says, do you have an opinion on dreams? Do you think they have any relevance? Well, it is kind of interesting that, I mean, dreams, I mean, they obviously have survival value. I mean, we wouldn't have them if they didn't have survival value. And they've done studies that you have to have a much larger brain in order to be as efficient as a dreaming brain if that brain doesn't dream. And that's one reason. I mean, when I was in college, I'm all over the place. But when I was in college, I wrote a paper on intelligence in dolphins and pointing out that they are, remarkably intelligent animals, and their brain is larger and more convoluted than our brain, even though they've got fewer appendages like fingers that have to be manipulated with this brain. So what is this huge brain for? And finally, years after I wrote that paper, I picked up somewhere the fact that dolphins with these large convoluted brains don't dream, that they can only sleep as long as they can hold their breath, which is about 6 minutes. So they take naps like 6 minutes at a time, and they just never get to the dream stage. And because of that, they need a larger, more complicated brain to compensate for the fact that they're not dreaming. And so on the other hand, a possum, like the American opossum, Didelphis virginianus, they spend more time dreaming, like in REM sleep, than when they're awake, which is kind of strange. But the purpose of dreams, like the biological purpose that has survival value, is it helps you to integrate what you've learned over the course of the day into your stored body of knowledge. It's just you're replaying stuff. Like all of you probably have had dreams where just some random event during the day just triggers this dream, where that is featured. And it's just like your brain is just sort of like storing information and like reinforcing like associative links with other topics and so forth. I assume that is the main purpose of dreaming. But you can have significant dreams. I mean, some dreams are like your subconscious mind trying to communicate with you. It's like stuff from deeper down is coming up into the level of conscious thought. And one of my favorite examples of that, I've already mentioned this before, it has been a while, is I had this friend, an Australian monk, who told me of this weird dream that he had. And it didn't make any sense to him, but it made perfect sense to me. It just clicked. I mean, it was just crystal clear what the meaning of that dream was. But he dreamed that he was in a canoe with like 3 gorillas. He was at one end paddling the canoe in this little lake. And these 3 gorillas are at the other end of the canoe, just sitting there, just peacefully sitting there being peaceful gorillas. And he's just paddling around and around in this lake, feeling like he's trapped, because he knows if he paddles back to shore, the gorillas are going to jump out and run amok. And so he's just, in the dream, he's just kind of stuck out in the middle of this lake, paddling around and around. And to me, it was fairly obvious. I mean, water, Sigmund Freud says this, and my experience kind of bear this out. If you dream about water, it tends to symbolize spirit or religion. And so he's dreaming about being stuck in this religious life, being a monk, and he's afraid to leave the religious life and re-enter worldly life because his gorillas, his animal nature is just going to start running amok again. So that was my interpretation, and he did eventually drop out of the monkhood because he did want to drop out of the monkhood, but he just felt like he was kind of trapped being a monk because he's afraid of, what his lower nature is just going to go back. The dog returns to its vomit and that sort of thing. So you can have like subconscious symbolism from a deeper part of your mind coming up to the surface, but for the most part, your dream is just processing information, and you're going to get just a lot of silly spam dreams. Not every dream you have is some sort of profound revelation. And, the ancients believed that dreams were implanted into our mind by a god, but I'm rather skeptical of that notion. So some dreams have relevance, but more dreams than not are just spam or just information processing, just your brain exercising and, strengthening associative links and so forth. So I'll just move on to Oyalt's next question, which is, what is the best way to be an artist? And I actually asked an artist this question, and she said, nowadays you just push the AI art button and there you go, you get this beautiful picture. So that's one answer. But the best way to be an artist, I mean, you have to have talent. You know, it's like, what is the best way to be a great mathematician or a great musician? I mean, if you don't have the talent, just the innate talent, then no amount of skill is going to turn you into a true artist. You might become really good at reproducing things. You know, you can be a really good illustrator, you know, with good technical skills, but ideally the technical skills are just there to help the artist, you know, express his creative imagination. You know, it's creative expression. And yeah, I mean, just to be a great artist or a really talented artist, a good artist, I mean, you have to have talent, just like if you're going to be a really good mathematician or a really good musician or a really good lion tamer, something like that, a really good fighter. You know, it just helps to have sort of like the karma, you know, the momentum from previous existences that have been going in one direction, predominantly in one direction, that'll help you. Like Mozart, I mean, he's composing symphonies when he's a little kid. There's a good chance that he was a musician in previous lives. So yeah, the best way to be an artist is to be born one, I guess, to be born with an artistic temperament and to have something creative to say, to have creativity and imagination that you are driven to express in some way. And then if you've got that, then just learning the painting techniques or whatever artistic techniques, the technical skills that you need, just helps you to translate what's inside you onto something outside you. So I guess I answered that question as well as I am able. I mean, I was probably best at art when I was like in high school, when I was like going through the emo teenager phase, when, you know, I was more, I don't know. I mean, you have to suffer to make good art, I guess, or at least some artists do, like Michelangelo or Dostoevsky. But then it's like I became more philosophical and less artistic, and just I'm a fairly good drawer, that kind of thing, but I'm not nearly as prone to like express my creative imagination, other than maybe a little bit in like philosophical essays. But yeah, I'm digressing big time. Yeah, my Q&A is really this. It's like 1/3 answering questions and 2/3 digressing. But I haven't really received a lot of complaints about that, so I'll just continue because that's just the way I swing anyway. So the next question is from Al Pacino Alpaca. And Al Pacino Alpaca says, Panyo, you probably still have dreams sometimes of being a monk in Burma. When you wake up in your bed as a layman, do you feel some kind of relief? And really, I hardly ever have monk dreams. It's strange. I mean, every once in a while, I'll have a dream where there's like monk elements. Maybe I'm wearing robes. Maybe I'm shaven headed. You know, I'm still sort of a monk, but I do not recall having a monk dream where I'm a monk in Burma since I stopped being a monk in Burma. So yeah, I just don't have those. It's kind of strange that I was a monk for probably 10 years before I was a monk in my dreams more than half the time. And sometimes it'd be like this hybrid dream where I'd be hanging out with my old high school buddies or college buddies or something, and someone would say, hey, let's go to this restaurant, let's go out and do something. And I'd say, okay, first I gotta wrap up, you know, I gotta cover both shoulders before I go out in public. So it'd be like this hybrid dream where I'm part monk and part not monk. And that's the kind of dreams that I have now. If there's any kind of monk elements at all, it's just like an element of being a monk, just when the rest of it is not being a monk. So if I did have a monk dream where I was a monk in Burma, I might feel some kind of relief, especially lately, because I mean, you hear almost nothing about it in the news, if not absolutely nothing, but Burma or Myanmar is in the midst of a full-blown civil war right now. Apparently Burma or Myanmar is not an important enough country for the propagandists to tell us much about it. You know, they want everyone focused on Ukraine and Israel and, you know, all the other wars going on. And there's quite a few are just, you know, who cares? These are the wars we want you to be concerned about. And that's really the way propaganda and just news in general works. News itself, especially lately, of course, is just essentially propaganda. So, and people are realizing that, which is one reason why they're preferring increasingly to just listen to some guy in his bedroom with a webcam just doing political commentary instead of going to like the mainstream news organizations, which have just lied themselves into a state of just being unredeemable at this point. I mean, they're just shameless propagandists. So better off getting your news from like Styx Hexenhammer than even from Fox News. I mean, you're going to pick up a lot of stuff, but you have to always be cautious. You have to be wary because most of it's propaganda. So I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to Al Pacino Alpaca's next question here. Oh, I got to fix some spelling here. All right. If the Buddha at the beginning was teaching to have no views and just to meditate, then why all the suttas? Why all this thousands of complicated teachings? Pali Canon is pretty big. Yeah, and I think this is the one I referred to several minutes ago, maybe even almost an hour ago, about, you know, the Atthakavagga is, you know, have no view, no belief, no perception, and don't follow rules. You know, you just go alone like the horn of the rhinoceros, be a radical renunciant, be mindful all the time, don't think. And then that's how like the oldest suttas teach. And then you get just more and more complicated and, you know, like philosophical stuff until finally the Buddhist teachings are called Vibhajavadan or Vibhajavada, which is, you know, the doctrine of analysis, the philosophical analysis, dividing everything up into these various factors. And then you wind up with like Abhidhamma philosophy, which is practically the opposite of what is taught in the Atthakavagga. And I gave my theory, just the charitable theory. There's two main theories. That if you accept that the Atthakavagga is very old, older than pretty much the rest of the Tipitaka, that you start with the Atthakavagga, few other suttas and fragments of suttas are just this really archaic substratum of Buddhism. And then there's two main theories of dealing with why you've got all this complicated stuff. And I already mentioned them, you know, in this video. One is that at first the Buddha was talking to advanced veteran practitioners. So he was teaching them the really advanced stuff. And then later, gradually, more and more beginners and intermediate practitioners and so forth, people at all levels are getting in. So he had to have teachings for all levels. And so he came up, eventually developed this philosophical system. Or you can say that most of what is in the suttas, you know, let alone Abhidhamma, is later developments. Sort of like a lot of Christianity is just later developments that wasn't taught by Jesus, even though some of them might be put into Jesus's mouth in the New Testament. So take your pick on those, or choose some alternative to those. But those would be my two main theories to explain the situation. And probably there's truth in both of them. It's like a combination of the two. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here, which is, do you need, this is also from Al Pacino Alpaca. He says, do you need some big ceremony to become anagarika, or can you just take 8 precepts from some monk, even online, and then live normal life as a celibate layperson? I assume spanking the puppy is also forbidden. Well, anagarikas, it's sort of a new system. I think it got developed like late 1800s by Anagarika Dharmapala, who was friends with the Rhys Davidses, who were the founders of the Pali Text Society and were also more or less theosophists. There are anagarikas in Burma that wear white and keep only 8 precepts, and they're called pothido, and it's mostly just little kids that are too young even to be novices. And some monasteries will have them. Mahagandayon near Mandalay in Amarapura in Burma has anagarikas, or did when I was living there. It's just these little kids, you know, they're like 5 years old wearing white robes, and because they keep 8 precepts, they can handle money. So, you know, they're going out and buying stuff for the monks. Although for the monks to tell them to go out and buy stuff is breaking the exact same rule as if the monks went out and bought it themselves. But it's not really mentioned in the texts. I mean, at least there's no well-established tradition based on the Pali text. It's just something that happened later. And most of the nuns in Asia are like a kind of female anagarika. They're not even really as far up on the totem pole as an ordained novice. So there's no real ordination procedure. There's only 2 levels of ordination. You know, like lower orders as a samanera or novice, higher orders, you know, using Catholic terminology, as a bhikkhu or monk. You know, the nuns had 3 levels, but you don't hear about that much anymore. So yeah, you can do a ceremony. I mean, in Burma, they have developed a ceremony where you go to a monk and you go, you know, you take the 8 precepts and, you know, get your head shaved and all that. But it's not really necessary. You know, whatever works best for you. If you really want to become an anagarika wearing white with a shaved head and keeping 8 precepts, then you could go to a monk and maybe they'll ordain you. They have them in Thailand also. Even some adult ones in Thailand. I mean, I was an adult one for a few months in the monastery where I was first ordained. I was an anagarika. I was possibly the world's largest anagarika, or pothido anyway, because as I say, in Burma, they're mostly like little kids, barely more than toddlers. So let's see. You don't need a big ceremony. You don't need really any ceremony to become anagarika because it's like an unofficial status. But probably in Burma and Thailand, there are monks who could like give you a unofficial kind of informal ceremony where you become one. I'm not sure about Sri Lanka. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Kriel. And I apologize to anybody if I mispronounce your name. So Kriel says, not sure if this has been asked before. What are your thoughts on secret societies, Freemasons, Illuminati, and satanic cabals? The theory is that since millennia, there has been an underground network of initiates that using occult knowledge and nefarious means gathered power unto themselves. In some theories, evil alien entities are involved in it, reptilians or draconians. Thank you. Well, I don't know much about secret societies for the main reason that they are secret. So you got the Freemasons, the Illuminati, the satanic cabals. I mean, people that join these things, you generally take a vow that they're not going to divulge the information. Like half of what I know about the Freemasons, I learned from Tolstoy's novel War and Peace, where it's describing how what Pierre Bezahov, he becomes a Freemason, and it describes the ceremony that he goes through with the blindfold and the sword and all that. My thoughts on the idea that there is an underground network of initiates using occult knowledge to gain and maintain power. I assume there is some of that. That there probably are secret societies out there that, you know, they're making offerings to Baphomet or something. I had this musician. He was a jazz musician, a trumpet player. From St. Louis, was telling me that in order to really make it big in music nowadays, you have to worship Baphomet. And he was kind of a bit on the paranoid side. He was definitely a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, maybe there's some truth to that. That, I mean, you have to be in some kind of cult. I mean, really, the left has become a cult in and of itself. Just some of the beliefs that they believe, you know, that women can have dicks, for example. It would have been considered insane just a few decades ago, and now it's taken very seriously, even by high-profile medical journals. Not because of any medical discovery, any kind of like breakthrough in science. It's just because the indoctrination and the dogmas have just changed, so that that's the way it is all of a sudden. But getting back to the secret societies, I wouldn't be surprised if there are secret societies where they're, you know, serving some sort of dark being, some kind of demonic entity that a pagan nowadays might call an egregore, where it's really not an objective entity. You know, there wasn't some being that flew through the cosmos to come to Earth to be worshipped by, you know, upgraded apes. That really it's just the belief in this people, this kind of group mind that gives a certain independent existence to this being, and you know their worship and, you know, belief in him and so forth just sort of maintains the existence of this being. But with regard to the elite doing this stuff, I really don't know enough about it. I have insufficient data to know to what extent someone like Bill Gates is some kind of demon worshiper, or, you know, making some kind of deal with the devil or something. I don't know. I'm not even sure if Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin did that. So, yeah, yeah, I guess I answered that. That's what I only know about it, because of course secret societies are secret. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Pranav. And Pranav says, I watched a video of an atheist who was saying that believing in karma is same as believing in God, because people who believe in God thinks that God will give them justice, and those who believe in karma think that some kind of natural law will give them justice. What do you think? Well, I mean, it's obviously not the same to believe in karma as to believe in God, partly because God is invisible. Unless you're a pantheist or something, you just think that everything is God. This is it. That mirror behind me is God. That door is God. You know, if you don't go that far, then you have no access really to God, unless you're like a advanced mystic. But I mean, karma from the Buddhist point of view is volition or will, and we're always exposed to that. You can observe volition, you can observe will in action. So, I mean, to that extent, they're obviously not different. I don't think that most people who believe in karma or God really believe that they will give them justice. I mean, it is kind of justice. You know, it's like, you know, a bad person is more likely to have bad things happen to them. A good person is more likely to have good things happen to them. I mean, that's pretty much observable, just objectively, empirically. I mean, that's just, you just look at the human race, and bad people are more likely to have bad things happen to them. Good people are more likely to have good things happen to them. I mean, it doesn't always work out that way, but there does seem to be a statistically significant correlation. But I think a lot of people are afraid of it. I mean, it's not that they want justice. You know, they don't believe in it because they want justice, because, I mean, like the idea of karma for Buddhists, I mean, it's so finely tuned. It's virtually impossible to do anything that is 100% good. There's always going to be a certain amount of bad karma mixed in with anything that you do, or even anything that you think. Even to believe that you exist, that's got delusion in it, and so it's got some bad karma involved. Anything motivated by greed, hate, or delusion is going to have bad karma involved with it. So, yeah, I guess I answered that question. But, yeah, it's not like a desire for justice that causes people to believe in God or karma, for the most part. Some do, but they would be a minority. Most people who believe in karma, I mean, it's just a kind of dogmatic acceptance of the religion that they belong to for the most part. So maybe I answered that question. It is kind of a hard question to answer. I'd probably have to be more familiar with the atheist and, why he was saying it, what his perspective was, rather than just this sentence here. But I guess I answered. I'm going to move on to the next one. We got lots of questions today. This is from Ruhe. And Ruhe says, hello, Panyo. Do you think access to full comprehension of anatta is an intellectual path, a jhanic path, or both or neither? Well, full comprehension of anatta would be beyond the intellect. And in a way, it would be beyond jhana also, because it would be more of an insight that might result from jhana. And in fact, this deep meditation where your thinking process has stopped really can result in some significant insight into anatta. Because like most guys, just a minute. Stop it. Quit snarfing on yourself. We got a dog noisily snarfing on itself back there. So where was I? Yeah, it's like you can't have this insight. If you get into deep meditation where your mind stops thinking, your mind becomes silent, then most guys identify with their thoughts. And so, I mean, just if they're not identifying with their body. So when you stop thinking and you're even more conscious than you were when you were thinking, then that can result in a considerable insight and can definitely loosen your attachment to the idea that you are your thoughts, you are your personality, you are your character, anything like that. So, I mean, understanding anatta, I mean, it starts off probably intellectually, and you might get some progress. At least it can cause you to be open-minded on the subject, at least inclined to, be open-minded to accept it maybe. And then you get into meditative states where you get deeper insight into it. But full comprehension of anatta probably doesn't happen until you become fully enlightened. And you have no longer any delusion, because, of course, the root of all delusion, according to the suttas, is the conceit I am. So, yeah, the intellect is sort of beginning practice, maybe necessary, but still it's a beginning practice. And then the meditative path is getting you closer and closer. But even just being in a state of like a mystical state, yeah, I don't think that's the same as full comprehension of anatta. It would be the subsequent insight that arises from the mystical state. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Tig. And Tig says, when you was a monk in Burmese, what brand of cigarette other monks be smoking? So I'm kind of wondering what Tig was smoking when he asked this semi-coherent question. Well, because he is American. I mean, he's relatively intelligent. He is capable of better grammar and spelling than this. So anyways, when I was a monk, some Burmese monks smoked cigarettes, but it was all Burmese brands of cigarettes. And I don't remember what the brands were. I think there was one brand called California, but it wasn't from, they weren't from California. They were from Burma. But I think even more monks, especially village monks, a lot of village monks will just smoke cigars, like hand-rolled Burmese village cigars. That there was one old monk that I lived with at a monastery in Burma where, yeah, he just got these big handfuls of these cigars that were wrapped in some kind of yellow leaves. I don't think they were wrapped in tobacco leaves. And I don't remember. There's all kinds of brands that just be on the little cigar band. There's some little local brand. But yeah, I don't remember a single brand of any tobacco product that any monks were smoking. And it's not nearly as prevalent in Burma as it is in Thailand. Because in Thailand, there's this idea that if Ajahn Mun did it, then it's okay. And Ajahn Mun was a very famous monk, 100 years ago or more, who was a chain smoker. He also ate cheese in the afternoon. So Thai monks think that smoking tobacco and eating cheese in the afternoon are fine because Ajahn Mun did it, and he was an arahant. But Ajahn Mun is irrelevant to Burmese Buddhism because most Burmese Buddhists have never heard of Ajahn Mun. So they're less inclined to think eating cheese in the afternoon is okay. That's just, the only monks who would eat cheese in the afternoon in Burma would probably eat rice and curry in the afternoon. And there's quite a few of those. And some monks, they'll smoke cigars, smoke cigarettes, smoke tobacco. But I don't think it's quite as prevalent as it is in Thailand. But again, in answer to the question, I don't remember a single brand, but it was all Burmese brands. And especially with regard to the cigars, it was just some local villager with their own little brand. So I'll move on to Tig's next question here. Do you consider the development of Pure Land Buddhism to be analogous to the development of Protestantism in Europe during the Reformation? Pure Land Buddhism teaches that faith in Amitabha is the most important thing a person could have. Similarly, Protestants believe that salvation is achieved through faith in Jesus alone. Yeah. Mahayana Buddhism in general could be seen as a kind of Protestant Buddhism that was more accessible to lay people. Like Theravada Buddhism, for the most part, especially traditional Theravada in Asia, is like a spectator sport. You got the monks are the pros. They're like pro athletes, and the lay people are just supporters of their favorite team. They meditate and they pray, they do their beads and all that. They'll do the ceremonies and take precepts and so forth, listen to Dhamma talks, but still it's like sandlot ball for them. They don't think that they really have any real chance at becoming enlightened in this life so long as they are not monks. And so they support the monks in order to make merit because they have been conditioned to believe that monks are a superior form of human life to a layperson. But I think I've strayed from the question here. Pure Land Buddhism, well, it arose, ironically, I was surprised to read in A.K. Warder's History of Indian Buddhism that Pure Land Buddhism was one of the earliest forms of Mahayana Buddhism to arise, approximately 400 years after the time of the Buddha. And I don't think it's really a good analogy with Protestantism in that respect. To say that Protestants believe that salvation is achieved through faith in Jesus alone. Paul of Tarsus was teaching that in the New Testament pretty much. So it's forcing an analogy. You can see parallels. There's certain overlap, I suppose. But I wouldn't want to force an analogy. It's weird. It's like Pure Land Buddhism is almost like Mormonism or something, because it's radically deviated from what the historical, biographical Gautama Buddha was teaching. In some respects, it's teaching the exact opposite. So, yeah, maybe, some Protestant Buddhism is like that. Protestantism very much downplayed monasticism. I don't think Pure Land Buddhism did away with monasticism the way Protestant Christianity did. Did I say Protestant Buddhism earlier? Sometimes words will come out of my mouth and I think I'm saying a different word. So, yeah, I don't think of Pure Land Buddhism in terms of Protestant Buddhism. What's happening to Theravada in the West is definitely a kind of Protestant Theravada, where monks are very much downplayed. I'm talking mainly about sort of the progressive, rainbow Buddhism of the left nowadays. That's definitely a kind of Protestant Buddhism, but I mean, in a way, it's sort of denigrating like people like Martin Luther, I guess. Maybe Henry VIII would be okay, but yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of apples to oranges in a way. I mean, you could find parallels, you can find similarities and so forth, but I don't really see the point in forcing an analogy. Each thing is itself. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Baba. And Baba says, "Hello, could I get your view on the role of cessation in awakening? Is it your opinion that the cessation experience that is talked of consists of an actual momentary stopping of consciousness or something else? If it is actual cessation of consciousness, what is the spiritual value of this experience?" And I've thought the same thing. In Theravada Buddhism, the cessation or nirodha samapatti, the attainment of cessation, is something that only a very advanced saint, someone, I think you have to be at least an anagami, so you have to be like this far away from full enlightenment, if not fully enlightened, to experience this nirodha samapatti. And because Orthodox Theravada says you cannot have consciousness without feelings and perceptions. If you're going to have consciousness, you have to have consciousness of something. You have to be perceiving something at the same time. So in Theravada Buddhism, when you attain cessation, and the more complete description of it is cessation of perception and feeling. That's what it's called in the text, cessation of perception and feeling. So because in Orthodox Theravada, you cannot have consciousness without perception and feeling, then they consider it to be just complete. I mean, you're going into a temporary coma. I mean, it's like suspended animation. There's nothing going on. So that, I don't see how there'd be any benefit from that. You wouldn't even be aware of having attained it. Because if your mind isn't working, you're going to have no memory of what it was that wasn't happening while you were in this state. I mean, you're going to have no memory of it. It's just it's a split second long coma or however long it takes. So I think that originally it was cessation of perception and feeling, but not necessarily complete oblivion. But Orthodox Theravada can't deal with that. But, there are ancient fragments to be found in the suttas saying that enlightenment is infinite formless consciousness. So, if your consciousness is no longer bounded by perceptions and feelings, then you may just merge into this infinite formless consciousness that Orthodox Theravada denies is possible. But it makes more sense because, like Baba says, and like I've been saying for a long time, this complete cessation where your entire mind just shuts down. You're not even going to know that you did it. You can't remember what you never experienced because you can't experience something if you're totally unconscious. It's just like a non-event if you follow Orthodox explanations, which I don't necessarily do, as you may have already noticed. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. And this question is from Avenity, who is Al Pacino Alpaca's biological mate, if I am not mistaken. And because she is a woman-type female person, she asked a woman-type female question, which I hope will not get me into trouble. She says, "Have you ever spoken to Arain?" And Arain is like a name that my sweetheart uses when she's online sometimes. Let me get back to the question here. "Have you ever spoken to Arain these words, quote, 'You see, sweetie, I'm wiser than you, I'm better than you, and I'm not as good looking as you, but I'm smarter than you,' unquote." So, yeah, I've never said that sentence. I've never told her that I can recall that I'm wiser than her. I certainly wouldn't tell her that I'm better than her. I have told her that she's better looking than me. But with regard to the smarter part, I can only remember one time. It may have been more than once, but I can remember one time that was relatively recently where I did tell her that I was smarter than her. And that was those of you who are guys, and most of the viewers of my videos are guys, according to my statistics. It's like 98% of my viewers are male. That you may know that females, the human female, as a general rule, not just one or two, but I mean in general, females have very adjustable memories. And for example, one time my sweetheart was in kind of an off mood. I mean, everybody gets into an off mood. Women are emotionally complicated and so forth, more so than guys. So while she's in this off mood, she asked me this rhetorical kind of question, which was, she asked, if she was 20 years old, would I be more attracted to her? And I just answered it relatively offhand. I'd say, well, probably, especially if I was 20 years old too. I mean, my sweetheart is pretty, and when she was 20 years old, she was just drop dead gorgeous. And so, yeah, probably, especially if I was 20 years old too. But within minutes, she had that converted into me telling her that I wasn't attracted to her. And she's brought it up just for months, just every once in a while. She'll like fling this at me like, you said yourself that you weren't attracted to me. And I never said it. So one time over something else, because as I say, women have very adjustable memories. I just pointed out to her, it's like, sweetheart, I'm smarter than you and I have a better memory than you do. So in cases of objective fact in which both of us participated, chances are my memory of how things happened are going to be more accurate, more likely to be correct than your memory of how things happened. So I said that to her. Man. I hope I don't get in trouble for answering that question. Well, I don't think I said anything bad. So, I mean, to say that women have adjustable memories is just a truism, as far as I'm concerned. But never would I say that I'm better than somebody else. I don't think I've ever said that to anybody. I'm better than you, or even wiser than you, because it's kind of a subjective thing, you know. It's wisdom. So I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to the next one. This is from Gaz, and this is another long one. This is sort of a semi-essay. Gaz says, hello, more of a comment, but perhaps you may wish to address it. I have recently been inspired to create a 3-hour-long YouTube video titled An Introduction to Theravada Buddhism. It would cover the entire life of the Buddha, all the basics, the various concepts and ideas, select suttas, the rules for monks, how to live as a layman, notable people and traditions throughout history, how to become ordained, information on the countries and people that practice it, the timeline of it all, its distinction from Mahayana, complex ideas, in short, everything. Might be more than 3 hours. A total overview in an order that would make sense, in brief if possible, with various chapters and visual information, finishing with the best book recommendations, channels, websites, etc., all to spur the viewer onwards with a clear vision of what it is they are getting into, equipping them with a solid foundation of right view, an authentic compilation that could be easily shared to anyone who is interested. I think something like this would appeal to those of us in the West who are very structurally minded and those who are used to religion being very accessible. However, I am not qualified to undertake such a task as of yet. Though my intentions would be good, I would certainly screw up due to my lack of knowledge and experience. Therefore, I shall defer to one who has as a monk, probably the one who has been a monk. Is this something you would ever consider doing or recommend perhaps such a video already exists. Well, probably it does, or it'd be more likely a series of videos, because to cover all of the stuff that that Gaz here has mentioned, I think it would be more than 3 hours long. And so you probably have to do it in installments, you know, like one video about this aspect and another video about that aspect. And in general, I lack the time and the energy to just go all in on a project like that. As I say, it'd probably be a series. There have been people doing it. I'm sure that you could find it on the internet. Maybe not exactly the way Gaz describes it, with all in just one video, everything just compact, you know, just the essence of Theravada Buddhism, everything you need to know about Theravada Buddhism in one video. Yeah, I mean, some videos, you know, deal with certain aspects of it. You know, they give it like a general overview. Like there's a few channels that I watch on YouTube. One's like Religion for Breakfast, I think, where he gives knowledgeable explanations. He's just a student of all religions. He's not a Theravada Buddhist. But yeah, well, it may be that in your studies and getting everything together, everything compiled and everything, you will learn what is necessary to do it. You know, if you're very careful not to make mistakes, you know, you verify every claim that you make, then yeah, it may be a very good learning experience for you if you have the time and the energy to go through with such a project, because it's going to be a big project. So, yeah. So I guess the only real question mark here is this something you would ever consider doing or recommend? I mean, if someone is drawn to do that, especially if they're going to give it a fair, objective, they're going to handle it in a fair, unbiased, objective way, then yeah, I'd recommend it. I mean, it's unlikely that I would do it anytime soon. I'll have to retire from working in a sheet metal shop when I have enough leisure time that I could really dedicate to a major undertaking like that. But if someone else is willing to do it, and I'm sure it's been tried, you know, there's books on the subject. I'm sure there's YouTube videos on the subject, that it's out there. But maybe not exactly the way Gaz here is describing, just this, you know, Buddhism in a nutshell. There was a book, Buddhism in a Nutshell, written by a Sri Lankan monk, I think, that I don't know if that would cover everything that he describes here, though. So, yeah, good luck. And I'm going to move on to the next question here. This is from Skuladin. And he says, do you plan on releasing the rest of your father's biographical occult experience? And one of the few things I inherited from my father was a collection of his writings. You know, it's just in a big box. It was all written on steno pads and like on typing paper and stuff. And I got about half of it, like the best half, the stuff that I consider to be the best, keyed into my computer. It's stored in my computer. And then I moved to a different place, leaving this box of my father's writings behind. When I came back to America, to this Burmese monastery in California where I had it stored, the entire building that it was stored in was gone. And I tried for weeks trying to track it down. And it's like, I don't know what happened to it. Nobody knows what happens to it. It probably just got thrown away. So at least I've got like what I consider to be the best half of his writings recorded, including his occult autobiography. And it's another one of those things that's going to take a lot of free time, more free time than I've got now, to edit the thing and turn it into a book. But that is still on the back burner, I guess, including, I mean, I've got enough material to edit a few books of my own material too, in addition to the 3 I've already got on Amazon. So yeah, I mean, probably I'll get around to it if I don't die first. But right now I have to work for a living, and it takes up a lot of time and energy, so that when I'm not working, a lot of the time I'm just wanting to relax and rest. And then I've got all these other things I'm supposed to do. You know, I've got to like do my part around the house to some degree. You know, keep my woman in good humor, that kind of thing. So yeah, I just do not have the leisure time that I used to have when I was a monk. I'm no longer a member of the leisure class. So I'll just move on to Skuladin's next question here. In Edgar Cayce's Atlantis book, it was said that there were quite a few people who had past lives during the destruction of Atlantis and reincarnated in America before the World War, and that Cayce warned them of the past in order to change their karma and the cycle of death and destruction. Is that common in the occult? And then it says, usually when people hear about past lives, it's, you are a famous historical figure, not, your son is gifted in science and mathematics because he was a chemical engineer and he should choose a profession that's uninvolved with the military-industrial complex, or he'll be complicit in the death of thousands and will have a miserable life. So let's see, the main question here is that common in the occult, where Edgar Cayce is warning people that, you know, they had brought destruction on their civilization as citizens of Atlantis, and that they should change their ways, start moving in a somewhat different direction in order to avoid repeating that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how common it is in the occult. It does happen sometimes, especially, of course, with past life regressions and, you know, people who are guides in that sort of thing. You know, generally you just have the past life regression and try to learn your own lessons just from what you remember. And with regard to Edgar Cayce, I mean, I read one book, I think it was called The Sleeping Prophet. He doesn't talk about Atlantis much, but he would talk a lot about ancient Rome, how a lot of Americans in mid-20th century, early to mid-20th century, previously had been Romans, and that a lot of their problems came from, you know, just going and watching gladiatorial combats and watching Christians and criminals being fed to wild animals and so forth, and like cheering and laughing, and that made some really bad karma that's coming back on them now. That sort of thing is fairly common, I think. You know, warning about, you know, having been a chemical engineer in Atlantis, though, personally, I am very skeptical of the whole idea of Atlantis. Personally, I think Atlantis was the island of Crete, the so-called Minoan civilization. That there's I mean, I've read the Platonic dialogues that are the first historical mention of Atlantis. You know, it's like you had this large island off the Pillars of Hercules, which would be, you know, the Atlantic Ocean. And they tried to conquer Greece, and the Greeks they fought back and won, you know, led by Athens. And it's hard to believe that, you know, a Bronze Age civilization is going to win in a war against technologically advanced Atlanteans. That in all likelihood, it's a garbled reproduction of a legend of maybe the Minoan civilization, the Aegean civilization centered on the island of Crete, tried to conquer the Greek-speaking Greeks, the mainland of Greece, and they were repulsed. And then sometime after that, it was the volcanic island of Thera exploded, which covered Crete in a layer of volcanic ash, pretty much wiped out their agriculture for that year. And it just probably wiped out much of their navy, you know, through tsunamis and so forth, which then caused their civilization to go into a kind of catastrophic decline, allowing the Greek-speaking Greeks on the mainland to conquer the island of Crete. So instead of being destroyed by some cataclysm, it was, I mean, they kind of got semi-destroyed by the cataclysmic explosion of a volcanic island about 70 miles away. And they maybe were a little bit technologically more advanced because the Minoan civilization was a relatively advanced civilization back then. And they got repulsed because the Greek-speaking Greeks They are martial barbarians who, I mean, they were still in the Bronze Age. Both sides were using Bronze Age technology, but sometimes, especially back in those days, just the more warlike barbarians, even if they're not as advanced, can still win just because they're more warlike and they just like fighting. They're good at it. You know, their society is largely based on martial virtues and martial values and so forth. So I'm not exactly sure why I wandered in that direction. Oh, just mention of Atlantis gets me going. Yeah, so I really don't think that there was any technologically advanced continent in the Atlantic Ocean called Atlantis. So in that case, I think Edgar Cayce was mistaken. Also, he had a prophecy that proof of the existence of Atlantis would be found in one of the pyramids by the end of the 20th century. And if that happened, it's being kept a secret because I haven't heard about it. So I don't know how well I answered that question because I'm not really sure how common in the occult it is to warn people that in past lives they developed certain tendencies that are dangerous if they continue with those tendencies. I'm sure it happens sometimes, but mostly the occult just isn't going about things in that way. I mean, you might have past life regressions and maybe some introspection regarding, you know, what your mistakes you made and so forth. But it's not nearly as common that you will have like a psychic announce to you that, you know, in such and such a life, this happened to you and you got to be careful not to do that. Maybe somebody like Neem Karoli Baba, you know, he'd look at you, he'd see your past lives, he'd just look right through you, he'd see what your karmic dispositions and so forth were, and, you know, he might make statements about that. I mean, like Ram Dass's books, he's talking about how Maharaji or Neem Karoli Baba would tell him, you know, in a past life you did this, so you've already got that down, so you need to work on this other stuff instead. So I don't know if you'd call that occult so much as just spirituality. You know, it might be more of a spiritual master telling you this stuff rather than, you know, just an occult practitioner. Although I guess there's a certain ambiguity between spiritual masters and occult masters. So I don't know if I answered that question. Some of these questions are kind of hard to answer. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next one, which is an easy one. And I do appreciate the occasional easy question. So this is also from Skulladen, like Aladdin with skull at the beginning. And he says, as a Southerner, where's the best place for fried chicken? And I just have to say, in this area, my favorite chicken place is called Rocky's Hot Chicken Shack. So that's my favorite place. My sweetheart's favorite place for chicken would be Chick-fil-A, which is kind of a Southern phenomenon, I guess. I don't think they have it on the West Coast, do they? You don't have to answer that. I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Nature Cure. And Nature Cure says, what do you think? Past Buddhas were Brahmin. How should we think of Brahmin religion? Is Buddha's teachings, Buddha's times, modern Brahmin? Well, according to Theravadan tradition, the Buddha, I mean, when you have like Buddhas in the past, you have, you know, it's Buddhas just keep occurring periodically, you know, and then the world is destroyed, a new world arises, and then Buddhas keep happening. It's just like a cosmic thing that Buddhas continue to arise in this world after the next, after the next, after the next. And according to Orthodox Theravadan tradition, the Buddha for that era is going to belong to whichever caste, whichever Indian Varna has the highest prestige, has the highest social status. And so, presumably in the Buddhist time, the Kshatriyas or nobles, you know, the ruling class, were considered to be higher than the Brahmins. So the Buddha became a Kshatriya. He was born as a Kshatriya and became a Kshatriya Buddha. But in eras when the Brahmin caste is more prestigious, has more social status, higher social status than the Kshatriyas, then the Buddha is going to be a Brahmin. He's going to belong to whatever is the highest class, essentially. So, and that's just, and we're talking about like ancestry here. It's not really followers of Vedic Brahmanism. So, I mean, even just because you're born a Brahmin doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be a Hindu. If you're born a Brahmin and become a Buddhist, then you're a Buddhist and not like a Hindu or a practitioner of, you know, Vedic Brahmanism, Vedism. So I think this is, past Buddhas were Brahmin. Yeah, I mean, it's just a class thing. It's more of a class thing than a religion thing. It's just social class. And the Buddha, according to Theravadan tradition, he's always going to be born into the highest social class at that time. So I guess Buddhism is kind of an elitist system, which is one reason why it tends to attract elitists in any culture. So let's see. I guess I answered that. I mean, this question is Buddhist teachings, Buddha's times modern Brahmin. I don't really understand that question. Is Buddha's teaching Buddha's times modern Brahmin? I think he's asking if Buddhism would be considered like the progressive or up-to-date Brahmanism of the Buddha's time. And no, that would not be the case, because Buddhism rejects the authority of the Vedas and any kind of Vedic Brahmanism, you know, Brahman in the religious sense rather than just the class sense, would have to, you know, accept the Vedas as authoritative. So yeah, that one I would say probably no. I mean, the Buddha was not a reformer of Hinduism. I had an angry Hindu just railing against me in the comments a week or two ago, just saying the Buddha was a Hindu. He was just, I mean, he wasn't any kind of, you know, his ancestors didn't invade in from the Northwest. I mean, he was just 100% Indian. He was black. He was a Hindu. And I mean, only Indians believe that, other than a few Westerners who have sort of a dogmatic faith-oriented tendency who convert to Hinduism. So they'll go along with the Indian beliefs on that. But no, the Buddha really was not a Hindu. He was not a Vedic Brahmanist, even though, I mean, he was constantly in contact with that. He knew about it. He was able to converse and like debate or just use Brahmin terminology, like Vedic terminology, that sort of thing. But that's different from Buddhism being a kind of reform movement of Hinduism, or like a neo-Hinduism or anything like that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Sanguine Ultima. And Sanguine Ultima says, what is up with Brian Ruhe? He seemed fairly lucid in the videos that you did with him a few months ago. Now he seems like he's gone off the deep end. And then there's an unhappy face emoji. And I mean, I'm hesitant to say too much about a friend. You know, I don't want to be saying stuff that he wouldn't like that might hurt his feelings or something. But Brian does admit to being bipolar. And before I was a monk, you know, back in the 1980s and so forth, I mean, it was called manic depression. I don't know why they have to keep changing the names of things, but I mean, he's manic depressive. And recently he apparently went through an extreme manic phase where he became just spectacularly, ostentatiously self-destructive. And he's just like acting as a whistleblower against himself, against his girlfriend, just saying stuff that, I mean, no guy in his right mind would say about his girlfriend in public, that kind of thing. Just sending, well, I don't want to get into it, but I mean, he just went in through this phase of just like brutal honesty, just beyond mere honesty, in which he's just like digging up the worst stuff he can think of against himself. And just, it's like he's trying to, it was almost like he was trying to socially destroy himself. Maybe through this idea, he's like in this totally exalted state where he just considers himself to have reached this new stage of just brutal honesty where, he's, I don't know. But that's essentially, it was like an extreme manic episode. And I'm not sure how he's doing now because he has gone silent for the past few days, almost a week now, I think. So I hope he's doing well. And any friends of his I suggest that you send metta because he may need it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Thermal Squid. And the Thermal Squid says, is humor an appropriate response to suffering? And it depends on the circumstances. Like, humor may be an appropriate response to your own suffering. It's a way of detaching from your own. It's better to make a joke about your own suffering than to just wallow in it and be miserable. Like, who was it? I think it was Sir Walter Raleigh, was it? Who made a joke right before he got his head chopped off at the order of, I don't remember who ordered it. Maybe it was one of those guys like Thomas More during the reign of Henry VIII. But, he just gets trumped up charges, pardon the pun, and just is sentenced to death, even though, the main thing is he just rubbed the king the wrong way. It was just, he did something the king didn't like. And so, off with his head. And so I think he was the one who he moved his beard out of the way before they cut his head off, just saying, my beard didn't commit any crime. Just gallows humor. That sort of thing may have some wisdom to it. But if you're going to make jokes, if you're going to be humorous about somebody else's suffering, then chances are that would only work with like tough guys. If it's like you're working with a bunch of tough guys and one of the guys hurts himself, you can make light of it, maybe making a joke about it. But you have to be real careful, make sure that he doesn't take it the wrong way. So, probably the safe route would be not making jokes about somebody else's suffering, even though making jokes about your own suffering may be okay. But this is sort of an intro to this essay type question, which follows, also by Thermal Squid, which is as follows. And I might add that this is the last question too. This is the very last question of the Q&A. So listen carefully. He says, what does Buddha Dharma say about latent fixations, obsessions, and mental occupation with queerness? And when he says queerness, I think he means like weirdness and not homosexuality. And then he follows up that with a kind of explanation. He says, I ask such things because of someone who has introduced me to the Dharma among a litany of eclectic philosophies. I would consider him wise, yet whenever the condition is afforded, he will be amused by the conceptualization of struggle, suffering, or grossness, such that he may find humor in things like obesity, seizures, things that are greasy or sticky, bizarre or erratic behaviors, deformities, or perhaps even the most disordered or desperate mental states. Especially paranoia, just these things as abstract ideas, never when actually presented or occurring. In certain circumstances, he finds extreme intoxication or ridiculous self-mortifying hypotheticals amusing beyond anything else in the world. In many ways, despite his wisdom and minimalist tendencies, I fear he is subtly sadistic, nervous, or unwell. I have seen that some Chinese Buddhists would snap or clap in the faces of practitioners or otherwise ask them puzzling or odd things, or that of Tantra having bizarre practices. I do not believe he is evil, but I think that this sort of thing is quite odd. He would oftentimes go to great lengths to describe the suffering of historical monastics, wise men, and mendicants, immersed in its details. I just cannot wrap my head around it and cannot seem to judge what is just a distinction in personality and what is actually pathological in a spiritual sense. Any input is appreciated. So that was sort of like the background, I guess, of him asking these two questions. One, which I already answered, is humor an appropriate response to suffering? And the second, what does Buddha Dharma say about latent fixations, obsessions, and mental occupation with queerness or weirdness? Because I don't think it really is referring to homosexuality here. What does Buddha Dharma say about latent fixations and obsessions? Well, a latent fixation or obsession, especially if it's subconscious, is called an anusaya, a latent tendency. And those are something that you have to become aware of and eventually overcome them, because it's making karma automatically when they arise. And so you have to have enough self-awareness and mindfulness to catch them when they arise and not react. Because if you act in accordance with these latent tendencies when they arise at the surface, then you're just making more karma and reinforcing that. So the mental occupation with queerness, I don't recall it really being mentioned in the texts. The Buddha himself specifically mentioning someone who is like amused by or fascinated by just like monstrosities, grotesqueness, anything like that. I mean, there is like lukananda, I think it's a word, where luka, I'm pretty sure, just means like shabbiness. So there's, it is almost like a virtue. You could call it a virtue that to like delight in shabbiness, but it's your own shabbiness. It's not squalor of somebody else. You're not delighting in somebody else's shabbiness or squalor or misfortune. Apparently, this person, he's not mocking people specifically, apparently, but just amused by just the existence of these things in general. And I really don't have a lot of experience with a relatively wise person who nevertheless delights in scoffing at just misfortunes and grotesqueness in general. Although I did have a friend when I was a monk. He was an American monk who lived in Burma also, who had kind of a strange sense of humor, and he was amused primarily by outrageousness. And he'd continually be making jokes about Antichrist and Satan and so forth. And my sense of humor is more based on absurdity. So, more of a Monty Python kind of sense of humor. So, I learned relatively early on, that, our senses of humor overlapped with regard to what was outrageously absurd or what was absurdly outrageous. But, he was kind of had like this weird semi-fascination with like Antichrist and Satan and so forth. They'd come up in his humor. But I mean, he wasn't a bad guy. It was just, I'm sure he had like a dark side, and he was in a way kind of processing that to some degree by making light of it, just turning it into jokes. And that might be kind of a coping mechanism for Thermal Squid's friend, where this dark stuff, this fascination with this dark stuff comes up, and then he'll make light of it as a way of kind of trying to detach from it to some degree, or, not wallow in it as much, at least try to, sort of, I don't know what I'm trying to say exactly, but I think maybe you get the gist of what I'm saying. So it may be something like that. Some stories of like what he's talking about here. Where is it? The suffering of historical monastics, wise men and mendicants. Sometimes that sort of thing is fascinating. Like Heinrich Suso, who is mentioned in the Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. That Heinrich Suso, the guy was weird. I think he was a student of Meister Eckhart even. He lived in the Middle Ages, and I think he was beatified or something. He never became a saint, but he would not touch his own body. He would touch his own hands. He would not touch the rest of his body. And in order not to touch the rest of his body, he made this harness thing that he would wear at night that had his wrists up around his neck. It was sort of like a collar with these two wrist holes. He'd sleep like that at night just so he wouldn't touch himself in his sleep. And then it was causing so much discomfort that he couldn't sleep. So then he had gloves made that were covered with needle sharp spikes. And in his sleep, he'd be itchy because he was just covered with bed bugs and lice. He was filthy, and he'd like scratch the itch and just rip these festering sores open from the last time he ripped them open. And there was all these weird things. He wore this underwear that also had needle-like spikes, except they were directed inwards, just to help him mortify his lusts or whatever. I mean, he was really, in some ways, he wrote this book on Christianity that was one of the most read books on Christianity in the Middle Ages. And so, he was capable of intelligent thought and so forth. And he had a certain amount of wisdom, while at the same time just being this weird, hyper-ascetic fanatic who was just torturing himself. And I don't know exactly what that has to do with Thermal Squid's friend. Oh yeah, because he was like interested in that sort of thing. And I have to admit, a case like Heinrich Suso is interesting just as a kind of anthropological study. Although I don't think it's really all that funny. It's kind of weird. I've got enough empathy that, when you talk about the suffering of another person, that, you realize that there's a connection. You shouldn't be making fun of somebody else's suffering because, in a way, it's your own suffering too, at some deep level. So, yeah, it could be, like I said, that he does have like this dark side that he is making light of by turning it into humor when it arises. I don't know. I'm guessing. And that was the last question. So, you know the drill. If you like this, hit like. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so. I wouldn't tell you to look at the links below because YouTube is still punishing me. I think it's 2 months that I'm not allowed to post any links, not even in comments, because I answered a question and my answer involved forbidden information that YouTube censors and then smites those who dare to state their honest opinion on that subject. So if you have any questions, just put them in the comments below. If you think that I'll be able to answer, I can't make any promises. If it's about Theravada Buddhism, that sort of thing, monasticism, meditation, there's a good chance I'll be able to give some kind of intelligent answer. But if you start getting into like secret societies, for example, I may not be of much help to you. And asking like long, complicated, nebulous questions that I don't fully understand. It's good to keep your question concise if possible. So I guess that's it. And so if you got questions, feel free to answer or feel free to ask and I will answer if I can. And if you want to know the URL links where you can get a hold of me or, see my other channels on the internet and so forth, see the books that I've got for sale on Amazon, then I would advise you to look under an older video that I've done or go to Rumble or BitChute where I am allowed to post links because Rumble and BitChute are definitely much more friendly to freedom of speech and expression than YouTube is. And with that, I will just say be happy.